Now, other facts that are available with regards to labs: you don't need a level 4 lab to actually perform biologic testing on substances. The Wuhan CDC lab is theoretically not a level 4 lab, so I do not know whether or not their safety protocols are as stringent as a level 4 lab safety protocols are supposed to be. But even looking at level 4 lab safety protocols, I reviewed literature which wanted to ascertain as to the risk that the labs potentially pose to the public, and asked for voluntary responses of various biologic labs throughout the world to identify the risk of potential infections and how many people had potentially been infected by these diseases for which there was no cure, and how many people had potentially died during the study of these labs. And they went back, I believe it was back to 1970, and of the labs that responded, the total number worldwide of people who were infected with diseases from the labs that had responded was, I believe, 1,032. And the total number of deaths associated with those infections was 10 to 12 deaths. Numbers seem to be a little bit inconsistent there, because you should pretty much know exactly, unless they died of something else during the course of their disease process. But anyway, there are 10 to 12 deaths. So obviously lab workers get infected, and lab workers can die from diseases that you have no cures for. I know this from a personal experience being in the medical profession. I used to do a substantial amount of interventional radiology, and during the course of studying or performing thousands of interventional procedures, I probably had 3 needle sticks during the course of my time frame of doing interventional radiology. So no matter how careful you are, accidents can happen and do happen. So there's certainly that element of it too that is a fact. We also have a fact that at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I believe it was 2017, they had a breach, and I believe it was 8 or 9 people were infected with the SARS virus. Chinese authorities later stated that it was a breach and oversight by their superiors, and 6 superiors were punished. Don't know what that means. In the United States, that may mean you get fired. In China, that may mean something completely different, and probably does mean something completely different. So those are the facts. Now we look at some of the fiction associated with the Wuhan lab and the coronavirus. There was a paper that was originally pre-published by a group of Indian scientists that described 4 segments of the genome of the spike protein on the coronavirus, which is those little triangular shaped things that pop off the coronavirus to allow it to bind to the cells. That 4 unique sections of that genome actually belong to an HIV virus. But that paper was quickly withdrawn after critics of it pointed out that the segments that they were discussing were so short that they could be found in many other viruses and even in human DNA. So it was definitely a fiction, but it certainly fueled a ton of conspiracy theories about the and then there obviously have been many other conspiracy theories about a bioengineered weapon, and that certainly is a possibility of it happening. But gene splicing apparently does a lot more disruption if you attempt to weaponize a virus than natural development. But what people fail to go ahead and discuss is that natural development, in other words, natural mutation of the virus, can that be enhanced by doing things to the virus to make it more likely to infect humans? For example, it appears that the SARS-1 virus was or came as a human-to-human transmission virus after entering the scaly anteater, the pangolin. So, or pangolina. Anyway, the possibility of these labs, which by their own admission perform tests on interspecies transmission of the coronaviruses, could they have obtained some of these scaly anteaters and injected them or infected them with the current coronavirus, and even though that was the one that came from bats, could it have conceivably changed within that animal or some other animal reservoir that they were testing on that would go ahead and allow it to become more infectious to humans and result in human-to-human transfer? Again, both these labs on their websites described studying interspecies transmission of the viruses. Now, if I was a lab and I had nothing to do with this, I would want to make dang sure that nobody could point a finger at me and say, oh yeah, well, what about this? What about this? And make all these speculative comments about me by opening up the lab to international inspection. Now, theoretically, the level 4 lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, based on it being a level 4 lab and receiving money from other organizations, including our own NIH, for some unknown reason, would have to comply with some sort of inspection standards. But I don't know what the international policy is for certifying these labs, etc. But I certainly think that, given the fact is that no matter how careful you are, you can't have a needle stick during routine procedures. You can certainly get an infection from viruses, as evidenced by the fact that of the labs that responded, over 1,000 people were infected by viruses and other agents that they were studying. So is it possible that after seeing the punishment of superiors from a previous lab infection incident, if you were a technologist or you were a researcher at a lab and you were punctured and more than likely probably infected, would you tell your superiors about it in China? I'm not sure that's a possibility. I think you would like to tell yourself that it's probably fine and go ahead and leave for the day when your shift was done with and go home, and if you were infected, it would be unlikely for anybody to know about it until you got to the point of being sick. Anyway, that's my take on the potential conspiracy theories. I don't think that just due to the fact that this was not potentially bioengineered with gene splicing techniques, that it completely absolves the labs from being the source of the infection. And given the lack of transparency of said labs and some other very questionable circumstances around employees at the labs, and the fact is that they were studying interspecies transmissions, I think that it raises the very strong possibility that this virus came from those labs. The patient 1 and patient 14 had no connection with the wet market. These bats weren't sold in the wet market. The nearest bat population of this particular coronavirus from 2 separate sources was 600 miles away, and then China kind of threw in a third source that it was 60 miles away. But even so, it seems to me that it would be rather unusual to have bats transported over any particular distance to just arrive in the wet market in Wuhan and expect to make a profit on them, especially if they were 600 miles away. And we do know that both of the labs in Wuhan were actually studying bats with coronaviruses and have substantial libraries of said coronaviruses from bats. So the most logical source for the original coronavirus is bats at one of the labs, and given the study of interspecies transmission, it is likely that there was a mutation and it developed human-to-human transmission, and somebody accidentally was infected and walked off the lab. That's my particular opinion, and backed up only by my suppositions and the facts that are currently available to me, as I've mentioned. But anyway, I'll list a bunch of articles down below in the description that you can go ahead and look at them on your own. Have a good day.